Bill Tomlinson is a professor of informatics and education at the University of California, Irvine, and he's a researcher also in California Institute for Telecommunication and Information Technology. He wrote a book named Greening Through IT in 2010, authored more than 100 publications, and also went to like Harvard and MIT for his PhD. So this is a quick outline of all the things you did, but the most important is your presentation now. So I think the virtual floor is yours, and yeah, have a good talk.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm honored to be here in such a esteemed company. Daniel and I have worked together for years, and I'm familiar with the work of many of the other speakers, and so I'm really honored to be part of this group. I also wanted to apologize. I was going to originally give the talk from my downstairs home office, but I have 2 young children, and some of the work that I'll be presenting is a little bit bleak, and I haven't yet talked to them about the sort of fullness of what my research is about. And so I moved to my wife's art studio upstairs so I wouldn't traumatize the kids. They're just heading off to school at 7:30 here in California. So I'll be presenting on designing ICT and the abundant present for future of scarcity. So first, I want to acknowledge my collaborators. This isn't just my work at all. This is the work of dozens of people, faculty colleagues and students, and many others who I've worked with over the years. And here's just a small list of the people that I wasn't able to list all the students because there are at least dozens, if not hundreds of them. But these are some of the key players in this work, and I just wanted to make sure that I recognized all of them. So I'd like to work backwards in my title and start with a future of scarcity, and then we'll move on to the other aspects of it. So I wanted to start off with a couple of maps that have been really instrumental in my thinking about this domain. And the first is a map that comes from the footprint network that Wakanagar and his colleagues have put forward. And it's a map that presents the biocapacity of a given country minus the ecological footprint of the people who live there. So here we see, and you can get this at footprintnetwork.org. You can see a map, and any place that is in red has more usage of resources than it has biocapacity. And you can see that a big chunk of the world does not have sufficient resources. And a relatively small number of countries have significantly more resources than their needs. And let me also just do an audio check. Is everything sounding okay on your side? Yeah, okay, I see some fists raised, so I think it's okay.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. And so this is a global summary of this map, and it shows that the ecological footprint of people in the world is greater than the biocapacity. So this is essentially pointing out that our footprint is greater than the resources that we have at our disposal, and that is a real problem. There are not enough resources to go around. So now I want to present a different map, and this is my visualization of some data from a 2015 paper that was in Nature, written by scholars from Stanford and Berkeley, in which they analyzed the way in which climate change affects gross domestic product. And they projected forward likely climate change scenarios and projected what the likely GDP would be in 2099. And so here's 2020, and so everything's more or less fine here. Anything that is in bright green is at least 1.5% per year growth. But by 2060, we can see some countries are starting to not have as rapid growth. And so so gray means between -0.5 and +0.5 GDP growth. And so by 2099, based on their projections, there is some pretty dramatic negative growth that is happening. 106 of the 166 countries they studied would be in sustained negative GDP growth. And while, okay, having 2% contraction of your economy in a given year isn't the end of the world, that happens all over the world during recessions, that this would be sustained, ongoing contraction, economic contraction. And I'm not an economist, but my understanding is that capitalism as we know it requires a certain reliable degree of growth, and that having 106 of the 166 nations be in sustained economic contraction would lead to all sorts of global challenges. It would lead to warfare, famines, all sorts of challenges, especially when there are entire regions that are suffering this at the same time. It's one thing if one country is having some challenges and the others around them can bail them out, but in this situation, the entire globe would be having an economic crisis. And so I took these two maps I just showed you, and I plotted the data from them in this chart. And so this is ecological reserve on the vertical axis, and it is GDP per capita in 2099 on the horizontal axis. And I'm not sure if the text is too small to see, but over here, Scandinavia is doing great. They are both projected to have a significant ecological reserve and a high GDP per capita in 2099. Then, so France and the US are down here somewhere. These are countries that are projected to have relatively high GDP, but don't have good ecological reserves now. So they will have certain kinds of challenges. This group over here is projected to has a high ecological reserve, but is not projected to have high GDP per capita. And the majority of countries are going to be low, are projected to be low in both. And so these countries are theoretically going to be okay, except for the fact that globalization means that everybody is interconnected. But these are countries that have stronger future prospects potentially. These countries, bottom right, might end up buying a lot of resources from these countries in the top left, and these countries are going to be in trouble theoretically going forward. And it is interesting to see some of these countries here. Russia is well positioned for a future characterized by climate change, and therefore the selling of oil, which is very problematic for other places around the world, might actually convert more of Russia's land into farmland, viable farmland, instead of permafrost and stuff. So it's interesting to see the differential effect that climate change could have on different countries based on what their projected futures are. So to follow on from these maps with some statistics from a variety of sources, it's projected that hundreds of millions of people will be displaced in the next several decades. So the World Bank projects 216 million people displaced by 2050. The Institute for Economics and Peace projects 1.2 billion by 2050. The UN projects 1.5 billion in the next 30 years. And there's a lot of uncertainty in these numbers in terms of who will be moving, where they will be moving. But this level of disruption, this level of global mobility is going to lead to a huge amount of human suffering in the next 30 years. And these are parts of the reasons why I feel like the end of my title, A Future of Scarcity, is supported by the data. Second, that's just the human impact that we've been talking about so far. Here are some other statistics that I feel like are salient. These are from news articles in the last couple of years. So the 2019-2020 Australian wildfires killed or displaced 3 billion animals. And the heat wave in British Columbia killed 1 billion sea creatures in 2021. And so, there are projections that 1 billion people will be impacted in the next 30 years, but 1 billion animals are being impacted right now, repeatedly, year on year. And it is likely that some of these impacts will ripple through into humanity as well. One of my colleagues, a senior professor at MIT who consults for the UN, has essentially written off 1 billion people. He thinks 1 billion people are going to die, and that in a discussion with him, he sort of was frank about that and was like, well, there's nothing much we can do about that, but we need to try to minimize that number. But like, we're already there in terms of 1 billion people. So those are some of the core, for me, statistics that paint a picture that is a future of scarcity. And that, to me, feels like a pretty big problem, something that we should address. And it's why my entire research is on this topic. I feel like it's the most important topic that we are currently faced with, that is likely to have severe implications for hundreds of millions of people and some implications for just about everybody on Earth. Professor Tom Murphy at UCSD painted one of the challenges of why this will be a difficult domain in a blog post he made called The Energy Trap. Essentially, we need to spend energy to fix these problems. We need new infrastructures, and we need to invest in research and development. However, as the problems grow more severe, human civilizations are going to be less and less able to sacrifice in the short term to address long-term problems. And so I wanted to read a quote from him. He says, "The construction of that shiny new infrastructure requires not just money, but energy. And that's the very commodity in short supply. Will we really be willing to sacrifice additional energy in the short term, effectively steepening the decline for a long-term energy plan? It's a trap." And so I think this is right. To me, I can feel this, where human civilizations are likely to use limited energy to address near-term problems. Politicians are going to be incentivized to fix problems on a 2 or 4 or 6 year time scale, because that's what their elections are predicated on. Companies may be willing to address it on a scale of months, but they are unlikely to address it on the scale of years or decades. And so this, taken together with some of the previous statistics, suggests that we are entering a future of scarcity. So we do. So this is a slide where I wish I had a nice sort of clickbaity title or a clickbaity bit, like, do this one thing and it'll all be better. But I don't, unfortunately. Wish I did, but I don't. So that ultimately is why I have a significant concern that we'll be entering a future of scarcity. We have clear, scientifically validated problems that are confronting us, and we don't have a good solution to them. Okay, so that's the first part of my talk and the last bit of my title. I'd now like to go to the middle part of my talk and the middle bit of my title, in the abundant present. So I wanted to just sort of noodle on some statistics briefly about oil. So in the US, we use about 20 million barrels of petroleum per day in the US. We have about 330 million people. So that's 0.06 barrels per person per day. A barrel of petroleum has the equivalent of 10,000 hours of human manual labor in it. So that means we have 600 hours of manual labor embodied in the oil each US resident uses each day. So essentially, US civilization's energy use from oil alone is like having 25 human strength robots doing labor 24 hours a day on each person's behalf, doing sort of manual labor at that scale. And this is just oil. It's not taking into account coal or natural gas or solar or wind or nuclear or anything like that. I was chatting with Daniel Pargman online, and he's a much better source for statistics like this than I am. So I encourage you to go up and talk to him during one of the coffee breaks. But it may be more like 100 or 200 X multiplier on human effort. So we have a great deal of energetic abundance right now. We use it in all sorts of different capacities. We use it for our food, for clean water, for taking cars to places and having dry cleaning and having fancy gadgets and stuff like that. But I wanted to push on one particular piece of it, which I've had a really sort of ambivalent feeling about recently, which is AI image generation. So in part because my background comes out of AI, my PhD was related to AI, and in part because before that I was an animator. I'm really interested in the visual capabilities of AI, and I've been messing around with Midjourney, which is an AI art generation where you give it text prompts and it produces images, and you can then sort of hill climb through that space to find your images. So here is a Midjourney image from the term climate change. Here is one that's a variant of detailed ecological life support system. Here's one that is a closed ecological life support system in the Art Nouveau style. Here is one that is minimalist Zaha Hadid design of a sacred place of the future with plants and city lights and curves. This is inspired by the work of an architect named Sarah Farayan, whose work I saw in one of Midjourney's shared rooms. And what I feel like is interesting about this, so there's an article that is an interview with the CEO of Midjourney, and he asserts that there has never been a service before where a regular person is using this much compute. And so I'm simultaneously fascinated by the potential of these systems and ashamed to be fascinated by them because of the harm implicit in them. The CEO says they use green energy compute providers, but ultimately it's using a huge amount of energy. And yet I feel like it can be inspirational in ways of thinking about the futures that we might want to, what we might want to have, what they could be like. They allow us to visualize different ways that things could be. Ultimately, though, I feel like AI image generation is an instance of the vast abundance that we have available to us, where we just can have an AI gin up an image of anything we want by typing a few words into a prompt. So a few weeks ago, one of my colleagues, a professor at the University of Kansas, and I were talking about the IPAT equation. This is a sustainability concept from the 70s. Barry Commoner and a couple of others suggest that the environmental impact, I, equals population times affluence times technology. And the IPAT equation has been critiqued in a number of ways. And so I'm not holding it up as sort of a central premise for this talk. But if I were seeking to destroy the global ecosystem as efficiently as possible, which I'm not, I would probably maximize affluence. Population it goes up and down much more slowly, but one can imagine a media ecosystem where every element of my experience, every piece of visuals, every bit of audio, all the filtering of what I get to see would be tailored by enormous banks of AI-based computation. In that respect, the AI image generation could potentially be a key component of how to spend as much energy as you possibly could as quickly as possible. And that to me is pretty unsettling. But simultaneously, similar technologies could also form the basis for adaptive educational systems, optimized production pipelines for food and water and energy. And the potential for AI is significant. And so I'm deeply ambivalent about it. I find it simultaneously desirable and terrifying. So a few of these images are going to be in the ephemeral museum that the organizers put together for this event, in part to prompt that discussion, to allow this community to talk about what is the role of AI in these settings. Leonard and I had a discussion online of the various different pros and cons of even including them in the ephemeral museum. And so we ended up deciding to include them. So I hope you all have an informed and interesting discussion about whether or not AI-based content should be or should not be a part of a more sustainable future. Okay, so now I want to get to the final part of my talk. This is, it's the first part of the title and the last part of the talk. So designing ICT. So given that we are likely to have a future of scarcity, and given that we have a present abundance where we have a great deal of energy at our disposal, energy time, how should we design ICTs to be able to take advantage of this abundance, to lay the groundwork for a high quality of life in futures of scarcity? And this is a place where I feel like all of you are really well positioned to do work in this domain, because you all are at the cutting edge of your respective fields. You have interesting backgrounds, and you have the civilizational positioning and resources to do really important work and to see the future clearly and take action in the present to address some of the looming issues that are to me pretty clearly coming down the pike. I wanted to start off with a number of different of my previous projects to sort of position myself in terms of what I've done so far. And let me also say, each one of these projects I feel like is wrong and I am embarrassed about in various different ways. And I hope that is good, and I hope you all feel that way too, because if you still feel like something you did 30 years ago is really fantastic and can never be outdone, you're probably not thinking deeply enough about it. Hopefully your thinking evolves, and the stuff you did 5 or 7 years ago, maybe it's still worth talking about for context, and maybe there were some nuggets of good ideas in it. But usually, if you continue to be think clearly about your work, you will realize how aspects of the way you were thinking were wrong or silly, and so if there are aspects of these projects that are wrong or silly, like, yes, that is correct, but they represent what the best thinking I was doing at the time was about it. So in 2010, I wrote a book called Greening Through IT. The main focus of this book was that environmental issues occur on larger scales of time and space than human brains evolved to be able to handle. And yet IT is the set of tools that we use to bridge those gaps in scale. They allow us to deal with scales of time and scales of space that are larger, or in fact smaller, than our sort of inbuilt mental capacities can handle. They can do projections into the future, like the map from 2099. They can look at things that are very large or very small. And therefore, IT is well positioned to address environmental issues. This ultimately is why I'm still working in the domain of ICT, rather than switching to ecology or earth system science or some domain that's more directly relevant, because I feel like if there is going to be a response at a civilization scale by 8 billion people, it's going to involve IT, and IT is going to be a force multiplier on whatever that is. And therefore, it feels like this domain, ICT, is central to this topic. But if ICT or IT is going to be a key role in this, what should it do? So here are some other past projects. So in 2012, a number of us wrote a paper called Collapse Informatics, and this was based on some work that SICT Silverman and I had written about in a CHI workshop in 2010. That had a little bit more inflammatory title. I think it was Precarious Infrastructure and Post-Apocalyptic Computing. But this then ended up becoming a full paper at CHI in 2012, and then led to a journal article in 2013. The core take-home from this paper was sort of the essence of the talk that I'm giving now: the study, design, and development of socio-technical systems in the abundant present for use in a future of scarcity. And this paper painted the relationship between collapse informatics, sustainable HCI, and ICT for D. And so it positioned it in the context of those other existing domains. So then over the years after that, the Computing Within Limits community emerged from that. There were parallel tracks of work that were happening, that Daniel Parkman and his colleagues and Bharath Raghavan and his colleagues were pursuing. And those came together into the ACM Limits workshop, which started, I guess, in 2015 and has been is still ongoing. And I believe you just heard about this topic in detail in previous talks, so I won't go into depth. Another project, this was a project led by Juliette Norton and in parallel by Bharath Raghavan, was looking at ways to use technology to more effectively pursue alternative agricultural approaches. So Juliette Norton's dissertation was on plant guilds, looking at permaculture and how to use computational support, or how to use computational tools to support permaculturists in their desired activities. And Bharath Raghavan led a project on computational agroecology, looking at a similar domains, the science of agroecology and how to use computational support to enable that, both of which had a focus on local food production. Another paper that arose out of that was the concept of self-obviating systems in which the successful operation of the system in the short term renders it superfluous in the long term. And this is something that I feel like is really a relevant concept when thinking about designing systems in the abundant present for use in the future of scarcity, because right now we have cutting edge computer systems. And yet, in a future in 30 or 40 years, where we may not have the same kinds of resources to pour into research and development and to pour into production of electronics, that it may be that we no longer have the same kinds of computational capabilities that we do now. I believe Daniel talked a little bit about peak oil in his talk, but people have talked about peak everything in a variety of capacities. And one element that's potentially relevant is peak technology. That if we no longer have the resources to support research and development, then Moore's law potentially slows down, and there may come a point where we no longer have the same kinds of resources, and we therefore may no longer have the same kind of technological innovation. There may come a point where future technological systems are worse than or scavenged versions of the ones that we have now. So designing self-obviating systems that render themselves unnecessary, may be a potential way to design systems in the abundant present for use in a future of scarcity. Another paper, and this is one done by myself plus a colleague, Benoit Aubert, who's was at Victoria University of Wellington when I was there in 2017, and is now a dean of the business school. I forget where he's in Canada, but I forget which one he went to. Information systems in a future of decreased and redistributed global growth. So what this paper was doing was looking at, given the projections from the 2015 Nature article that I cited earlier, what are the implications of that for the future of information systems and the industries around them? So in 2014, on the left-hand column here, this was ICT goods exports. This was the total volume of ICT goods exports in an ordered list by country. So then projecting that out, what we did is we analyzed which countries would likely to be the leaders, assuming that their ICT goods exports scaled in proportion to their gross domestic product, which is not exactly a safe assumption, but it was the best we had to go on. And so China will retain its dominance in this domain, theoretically. South Korea will rise. Oh, sorry. Germany will rise. The Netherlands will rise. The US will fall. The Czech Republic wasn't even on the list of top 10 and rises. So this would be for exporting ICT goods, physical devices. In terms of ICT service exports, the US is currently the leader in that, followed by the UK, but the US is projected to fall significantly, and the Russian Federation is projected to rise significantly. And so whether or not these exact projections are proven out by 2099, and I'm sure they won't, because the reduction in GDP such that 106 countries will be in negative GDP will lead to wars and reconfigurations of national boundaries. And so some of these countries may no longer exist. And so therefore the 2099 lists are almost guaranteed to be invalid. It does paint a picture of the different landscape of ICT goods and services on a country basis that we might see in the coming decades. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about some of my current projects. Those are the past projects that are most relevant to this work. There are a variety of others as well. But I wanted to talk about some of the current projects I'm working on.
Bill, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. You have like 10 minutes to go? Like,
perfect.
Is it okay?
That sounds perfect.
Cool.
Yep. So right now, Don Patterson, one of my colleagues, and I have been working on a sustainable and equitable currency platform. And this project is similar in some ways to cryptocurrencies, but cryptocurrencies as they currently exist are a disaster for a number of reasons. And so hopefully this project, even though it is in a similar space, is not a disaster in the same ways. And hopefully we're going into it in a way that is clear-eyed within falling into pitfalls. But proof of work which underlies Bitcoin is an environmental disaster, and many of the other cryptocurrencies that rely on proof of work are similarly flawed in that respect. Ethereum is currently in the switchover from proof of work to a thing called proof of stake, which is much better environmentally, but it has a second problem, which is that it's a disaster for wealth inequality. The only way to earn transaction fees in a proof of stake world is to have existing money, and therefore proof of stake is a rich get richer scheme. So right now we've been designing an alternative that has lower environmental impact per transaction than Bitcoin, Ethereum, Ethereum 2, or Visa. And that would potentially provide a mechanism for distributing billions of dollars of transaction fees to 90% of the world's population. And so I just wanted to, here on the right, there's one chart from the paper. The Genie Index, how many people have heard of the Genie Index, just to show of hands? Okay, only a couple. So the Genie Index is a measure of wealth inequality in a given country. And right now, the Genie Index globally for most countries, or the median Genie Index is around 37.5. And so we made a simulation where if you take a simulated country and have it have an economic system based on either proof of work or proof of stake or something like Visa, that just continues to make the Gini Index higher, which means there is greater wealth inequality. And greater wealth inequality leads to all sorts of problematic health outcomes and other civilizational health outcomes. So a higher Gini Index is bad for a civilization. The system that we have created pushes back against the Gini Index. And so here are the blue line. You can see over time that the system that we're putting together hopefully would help drop the Gini Index over time. So that's one of the projects that we're currently working on. A second is a project about knowledge graphs. Knowledge graphs are an aspect of AI. It's a way of representing knowledge in a way that is accessible to computational systems. So Wikipedia is a source of knowledge that is accessible to humans. You can type in a set of words, it will pop up the article on The Walking Dead, and you can then read articles about all of the different actors who are The Walking Dead. And it's a form of knowledge that's accessible to humans. There is a sister site to Wikipedia called Wiki Data, which is a similar set of content that is designed to be computationally accessible. Because, for example, with Wikipedia, you could go read the article on climate change, and you could read the article on sea level rise, and you could read the article on climate migrants. But it would be hard to computationally string those together to create a narrative like climate change causes sea level rise, and climate change causes, and sea level rise causes climate migrants, therefore climate change causes climate migrants. Whereas with a knowledge graph representation, you can do more of those kinds of computational processing on these bodies of knowledge. And therefore, knowledge graphs could potentially form the underpinnings for future intelligent systems. Unfortunately, though, sustainability topics are very poorly represented in Wiki Data, which is the largest open knowledge graph. All of the actors in The Walking Dead are in Wiki Data, but most of the clauses of climate change that exist in Wiki Data are there because I added them in the research project by hand. So it is not a well-represented space in topics that are important to the kinds of research that people in this room are doing. So this is a project led by my PhD student, Hayden Friedman, and in collaboration with Andre Vanderhoek, another professor at UCI. We're developing technologies and socio-technical systems to try to improve the representation of sustainability in Wikidata and in other knowledge graphs, in part because putting them into Wikidata puts them into other knowledge graphs because, for example, Google harvests from Wikidata for its own proprietary knowledge graph. So if you put things into Wikidata, they get into other parts of the world as well. And we're also using these improved knowledge graphs as a basis for new approaches to sustainability education. And so I teach a big 300-person undergrad class. And so we've been using that as sort of a laboratory for exploring ways to use knowledge graphs to support sustainability education. And so I have a half-baked scheme that I've been thinking about and trying to decide whether or not it's viable, and if it's viable, whether or not it's a good thing, would be to hook up the knowledge graphs to the AI visualization tools that are becoming more available to try to make custom-tailored educational content for each of the students in my class and potentially for each of the students all around the world. The core vision for this would be to give students a quiz at the beginning, a sort of a formative evaluation of their knowledge. Based on that, I would be able to get a model of what they know and what they don't know and what misconceptions they have. And then combining that with an expert level knowledge graph of sort of what we aspire to have them know at the end, I would be able to get a unique pairing of what each of my 300 students might want to know, what they need to learn, what preconceptions they need to be disabused of, and then potentially help use AI to help craft some of the some content that could guide them on that trajectory. This is challenging for a number of reasons. AI has a history of doing a terrible job at education. AI is also hugely environmentally impactful. But the other alternative would be to design it by hand, and so I'm not really sure how to do it at scale. So that's one of the things that I've been thinking about going forward. To sum up, I think I have 3 minutes left. So to sum up and to conclude, the first part of my talk, the world is likely to be heading towards scarcity for many people and for non-human species. We currently have access to free time and available resources that have unparalleled power. ICT has enormous costs, but it also has the potential to transform how we live in the world. And I'm of the opinion that we need dramatic civilization scale changes in the coming years and the coming decades, and that you, the people in this room, are socially positioned to lead these changes. So I'd like to end with an exhortation and encouragement. I'd like to ask you to pursue your work boldly. The fact that you're in this room at all means you're doing it right. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for choosing this career path. Most of you could be out making more money some other way. Most of you could be doing all sorts of other things because you're smart and interesting and have good ideas. Thank you for choosing this as your domain. I would encourage you, though, not to, in your work, there are many forces that will encourage you to do incremental work to sort of chip away at the next paper that will eventually get you a professorship, that will eventually get you tenure. And it's very easy to fall into a process of grabbing the next small incremental bit. I would encourage you instead to present new world visions, to think about ways that the world could be, because the way we currently have isn't working. In the next 30 to 50 years, we are likely to encounter significant civilization scale problems. We already are in lots of ways. And I would like to ask you, help fix it if we can. And one of the ways you can do that is to work together with the other people in this room, work together with experts in other domains, because even though you all are positioned to lead this domain, you only know what you know. You know a subset of things, and there are experts in other areas whose expertise can be productively deployed to help make visions that work for everybody. I'd also encourage you to look out for those who can't look out for themselves. There are billions of people in the world who are less capable of looking after their own well-being than you are. There are billions of animals that are not capable of looking out for themselves because of the impacts that human civilizations are having. Thank you for looking after non-humans in particular. And I'd also like to ask you to find joy in your work. One of the challenges, especially, for example, in the first third of my talk, it can be dark. There are parts of it that are scary and sad and terrifying. And I'd ask you to try to find joy in your work, because you'll do it better and you won't burn out as much. And so for me, I really like to write code. And so that's one of the ways that I find joy in it, is I can find opportunities to go write code because I like it. In summary, the right idea that any one of you could have presented in the right way could potentially reach 1 billion people by tomorrow, and it could restructure the world. And so I wanted to end with a story from one of my mentors, Hiroshi Ishii, professor at MIT. He drew a line on the whiteboard, and he wrote, this was, I don't know, it was like 2002 at the time. He wrote 2002 and made a little line. And then he made a line that was 2050, and he put a little tombstone, R.I.P. Hiroshi, that he'd be dead by 2050. And then he went out a little farther and he made a tombstone at 2100, and he said, R.I.P. all of you, You'll all be dead by 2100. And then he made a line farther out. And he started talking about that line and said, you should look for the impact of your work 200 years in the future. And it's hard to know what the future will look like in 200 years. But unless we take significant action now, it is going to look a lot worse than it does right now. And so I encourage you to continue to pursue the work that you're doing and look for the impact that your research can have 200 years in the future. So with that, I'd like to end. I'd like to thank all my collaborators, especially Daniel Harbin, for his feedback on the slides. I'd like to thank Leonard and the rest of the organizers. I'd like to thank the NSF, who has funded a bunch of this research. And I'd like to thank all of you for your attention. And the other day, I was reading some educational research that was saying that asking, are there any questions, causes people not to ask questions. And instead saying, please ask me 2 questions will much more likely cause people to ask you questions. So please ask me 2 questions. Thank you for your attention. Please ask some questions.
Great. Thanks a lot, Bill. I don't know if you hear the applause, but there are a lot. So
great. Thank you.
Yeah, just looking at people here. So just raise your hand if you have questions, just to see how many questions we have to deal with. 1, 2, some other. Okay, so let's start with 2 questions as you ask, and then maybe other will pop up.
Thank you for your interesting talk. I was wondering how you position yourself towards the idea of growth and green growth. And in the examples that you gave, maybe I felt it wrong. I had the example that I had the feeling that you gave examples that in which we have IT that just helps for growth. So do you maybe have examples of relevant applications that are not unsuitable with the idea of post-growth or degrowth?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, because yes, I am not a pro-growth person. Growth is not viable in the long term. What I think the challenge we have right now is that growth is the world we are currently embedded in relies on growth. And if civilizations that we're currently embedded in don't get growth, they will instead give warfare and famine and stuff. And so what we need are ways of getting to a world that does not rely on growth. I don't necessarily know how to get there, and I'm not an economist, and so I haven't focused on that. But thank you for asking that, to give me a chance to clarify that I would aspire to a world that is much more of a steady state type context. One of the real challenges with that, though, is I have a concern that if a subset of the world starts pursuing a non-growth agenda, the growth-based bits of it will simply take it over, and I don't know how to confront that. And it is that is among the conundrums that make me fearful for the future. There's a scholar who we cite sometimes, John Michael Greer, he's the archdruid of the American Druidical Society. So we don't necessarily cite his work in academic publications because he's a druid, as opposed to a sort of more academic vein scholar. But he suggests that we don't have environmental problems, we have environmental predicament. That a problem is something to which there is a solution, and a predicament is something to which there is not a solution. And I don't know if there is a solution to this. I'm concerned that there is not a good solution to it, which is why, rather than positioning my work as, or rather than seeing my work as, let's all go technology our way out of this and it'll be great, that it is likely to be a future of scarcity. And there can be 2 different kinds of scarcity. One is scarcity where we go into it clear-eyed, we go into it with an awareness that there is going to be scarcity, and we figure out ways to allow for a high quality of life for humans and non-human species that does not require the same kind of material necessities that we currently find. But if we can't work out a way to do that, sort of one will be forced upon us by circumstances, that we will, humans will simply use up all the resources. And so my undergrad degree was in biology, and one of the classic graphs that we were shown in sort of first year ecology is a rabbit population. If you put it somewhere, it'll reproduce until it goes way up and uses all the resources, and then it dramatically falls off. And we're certainly doing an excellent job of the first half of that curve, and I'm concerned that we may encounter the second half of that curve. But one other story in that domain. Do any of you know about the reindeer of St. Matthew Island? Okay, a couple people raised their hand. So for those of you who didn't, so in World War II, the U.S. Coast Guard, I think, or the U.S. Navy, thought it would be a good idea to have a source of food off the coast of Alaska. And so they moved some reindeer from mainland Alaska onto this island called St. Matthew Island. And I think they moved, I forget how many it was like 18 or 29 reindeer over onto this island. And these reindeer thought it was great. There were no natural predators. They didn't bring any wolves over. And the reindeer took off, and they reproduced, and there were lots of reindeer. And at the end of World War II, it wasn't anybody's job to move the reindeer off St. Matthew Island, so they all thrived. And then in the winter of 1964-65, there was a rough winter, and there were too many reindeer, and they ate all the food, and all of them starved to death except for 43 of them. And when I tell this story, on the one hand, it can be, one can say, oh, those silly reindeer, why didn't they make canoes and paddle off St. Matthew Island? Or why didn't they engage in family planning? Or why didn't they invent agriculture? And the reason they didn't do those things is because they're reindeer. They don't have opposable thumbs. They don't have the cognitive apparatus to imagine agriculture or canoes. Similarly, on a bad day, I have a concern that humans don't have the cognitive apparatus to be able to manage the challenges that we're currently faced with. And I don't quite know what to do with that. On a good day, I feel like, okay, maybe with IT, we can envision a future together that can get us past the current looming crisis. But I'm not sure of that. So, but with regard to bringing it back to growth, growth is clearly what underlies the first half of the rabbit curve or the reindeer on St. Matthew Island curve. Eventually, you get to the limits of your resources. And while some people may feel like we can eventually go to Mars and colonize other planets, one of the real challenges is if we can't make a go of it here on Earth, what's to say we can make a go of it just by moving to other planets? It seems like, it ought to be easier to do it when we're not fighting all the forces of outer space, when we're just like, trying to make food grow in a desert. So yes, I feel like it would be lovely to be able to have a steady state or degrowth future. I don't necessarily know how to bring that to pass, and I'd be excited if any of you in the room have visions for how to make that go. I know Daniel talked a bit about the steady state economy, and so he may have had some thoughts on that. But I'd be excited to hear more. I don't have obvious solutions to that, but yes, I aspire to a steady state or degrowth future. I'm not quite sure how to bring it to pass.
Thank you. So we have one there. I think we had one there as well. Okay. So we have about 10 minutes left, and maybe a little bit more, just to give an idea.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering about your current work. So you develop system that relies on infrastructure, digital infrastructure. Do you expect those infrastructure to stay in the future? And how do you use the notion of resilience when you build your system so that they are able to sustain in the future?
so thanks. Let me tell a little bit of my own personal narrative that underlies it. I had some slides that I was going to give, but then I sort of I took them out of the talk, but I'll just sort of talk through them now. So in 2000, so okay, as a kid, I was really interested in animals. That was sort of my gig. I liked animals a lot, and that formed the foundation of how I came to understand the world. So when I was approaching tenure, once I realized I might actually get tenure, and I was like, well, what am I going to do for the next 40 years? This was in around 2005. I shifted into sustainability and was like, oh, basically it was sort of like a grown-up version of let's go look after the happy little animals. Then in 2009, my wife and I had our first kid, and suddenly sustainability took on a much more acute problem, because I had this infant in my arms who I had sort of deep and abiding, millions of years of biological evolution love for. And I was like, how am I going to protect this small, fragile thing that my life is invested in? And that is around the time that I started thinking about some of the issues of collapse and civilizational scale challenges, rather than just being able to sort of. Previous to that, I was more of a let's engineer our way out of it type approach. And this sort of perspective accelerated, and then we had a second kid, and by 2017, or in 2016, when Trump got elected in the US, that pushed my wife and me over the edge, and we moved to New Zealand, because going back to let me go back to my chart. This is when I was making the first version of this chart. That one there. New Zealand was sort of the top right entity that speaks English, basically. And neither of us are fluent in a different language, and we thought Scandinavia would be a little bit chilly. So we ended up moving to New Zealand because I was concerned the future was not going to be viable in the US. And I thought New Zealand would be a better place for our kids to grow up. So we lived there for a year, and we're intending to resettle there, to move our whole gig to New Zealand. And as we were there, we realized that New Zealand was going to end up, it felt like it was going to have the same problems the US had. It would just be pushed down the pike a little bit. It would just be a decade or two later. And in fact, it seemed like it would probably go to a agrarian society more quickly, because the ships full of goods from China and the US and would not flow to New Zealand much. The flow of goods and services would stop much more quickly than they would necessarily in the US. And so that, with a variety of other factors, we ended up moving back to the US, and that has sort of ushered in a shift in my thinking of sort of, well, if I can't escape from it, I guess we're going to have to try to fix it. And I don't know how to fix it. I'm not confident we can fix it, but that's sort of, I don't feel like there's any place in the world that will be insulated from the shifts that are coming. And so in that respect, so bring it back to your question about resilience. I feel like that is a critical topic, and it's something that global supply chains are not very good at. Corporations are heavily invested in optimizing for efficiency rather than for resilience. That we would be much better served to have, from a resilience perspective, have smaller units of organization with much greater redundancy. And yet that flies in the face of corporate profits. And that is a really hard thing to grapple with. And I feel like that's something that's true in many different aspects of how the world is these days. I find, okay, with regard to my kids in technology, and myself in technology, I find it is very difficult to not use technology in ways that the engineers at Facebook and Twitter and Netflix and Amazon want me to, because when you have 1,000 engineers whose whole job it is to break down a person's willpower, they're smart people who are paid a premium wage to do so, they're good at it. They will effectively do so. And so I don't know how to grapple with the fact that, yes, I feel like resilience is something that we need, something that will be critical to our collective future. And yet it is opposed to the current model of how corporations envision their own financial futures. And academics and researchers are you know, we try to do the best we can, but we're small fish in a big pond, and there are an awful lot of forces in that big pond that are pushing against resilience. And I'm not sure quite what to make of that. So I'm sorry not to have a better answer to that, but yes, resilience is desirable from the point of view of the factors that I've been talking about in this talk. But civilization forces are pushing back against it hard.
Thank you. Maybe, yeah, the last question. I think just on your right there. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I wanted to go back to Xylem, the new cryptocurrency that you are working on. So, so my question is, in the beginning of cryptocurrencies, there was a lot of hope put in these cryptocurrencies. So we thought that it would make people more independent, give them more power from for money transactions. And I mean, I'm sure there were a lot of well-intentioned people there, but how is Xylem going to change the fact that later we saw that Bitcoin became something that was very consuming ecologically, and that it was also worsening wealth inequality? So is it by design that Xylem does not hold these problems? One first question. So is it like really you're sure that it will not worsen wealth inequality and it will be better? I guess for sustainability and ecological problems. And second question is, what I think is that we not enough ask ourselves the question of, do we need something in ICT before we create it? So what do you think, why we need Xylem for the future? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And let me also say this. We have, even though I've written 16 single-space pages of text about it, and we have, you know, a year's worth of code under our belt, if this is a terrible idea, we have not submitted it for publication yet. And if you can convince me of why it's a bad idea, I can stop doing it. Nobody has yet, but I would like to be disabused of it because I don't want to introduce bad things into the world. Let me describe a little bit about how the technical underpinnings work to see if that helps describe why hopefully it would be different. So in order for Bitcoin or Ethereum to allow a distributed community to converge on a given agreed upon set of transactions, there needs to be something that creates a delay. And in both proof of work and proof of stake, that is engaging in a hash function. You have to solve a puzzle, a mathematical puzzle. And with Bitcoin, you have you know, billions of processors working as hard as they can to solve that at the same time. With proof of stake, you have a much smaller group who are doing it in proportion to how much wealth they have, is my understanding. The system that we're building is based instead on the speed of light. So the notarization process involves sending a message among a set of people all over the world. And instead of having to use a lot of energy to slow down the process, we use the fact that you can't send a message faster than the speed of light. And in fact, messages go typically slightly slower than the speed of light. And so therefore, if I send a message from here to India, to Africa, to South America and back, you know, if I connect enough people in different areas, I can create a suitable length of delay. And so the infrastructure that we're building is based on anyone with a smartphone being able to be a node in this system that creates the delays, and from that they will be able to earn part of the transaction fees. And right now there are 1.09 trillion digital payments per year. Their average value is a little over $8, And that leads to something like $175 billion in transaction fees. And so the system that we've built, or that we're building, seeks to distribute those transaction fees equally among anyone with a cell phone or with a smartphone. And by 2025, 90% of the world is projected to have a smartphone. So therefore, everybody but the poorest 10% who unfortunately can't afford smartphones would be able to engage in this infrastructure, and it would be based on where you are geographically located, not based on any other factor, such that it would effectively sprinkle transaction fees all over the world. One aspect that we've been thinking about, though, is constraining where it drops those transaction fees to places that are less environmentally harmful. So, for example, you wouldn't be able to earn transaction fees in a national park or in a protected region. It would only be in places where there are already larger collections of people. So, from this, we anticipate that if it were to be deployed at global scale, 1 billion people could each make $175 a year. And $175 doesn't make any difference to Jeff Bezos, but if you're making $2,000 a year, like a person in the 10 to 20th percentile of global income, $175 is days of work. And thus it could potentially allow the transaction fees that are now mostly going to Visa shareholders and shareholders in other financial infrastructures. It would allow those to go to potentially billions of people all over the world. So, so that's sort of the mechanism by which we see this as distributing wealth. So if you can tell me why that's a terrible idea, that would be awesome. So I don't submit the paper for publication in a month or two. And you're also welcome to email me offline, because I know we're actually 3 minutes over time. So you can email me about why that's a bad idea, and that will help protect. But, or if it's, if there's some other way to approach it, I'd be happy to hear, because that's one of the nice things about giving talks like this is getting to, especially in the age of the pandemic, getting to talk to smart, interesting people about things I'm working on, so that I'm only working on stuff that's doing good, not creating harm.
Great, thanks. Maybe we can applause one more time and then close the day.